Africa, a continent in desperate need of strong and genuine leadership, has seen many of its leaders rise from promises of liberation, prosperity, and hope. Yet, it is shocking how many of these leaders praised and saviors during struggles for independence and post-independence, tuned against their own nations to oppress, exploit, and inflict pain even greater than the colonial rule they once resisted. Among these, the reign of dictators who betrayed their people, bringing suffering and destruction to their nations. Today, we journey through the chilling stories of the top 10 worst dictators in Africa. First on the list, we have General Sani Abacha, the Nigerian leader who ruled Nigeria from 1993 to 1998 after overthrowing the interim government led by Ernest Shonkani in a military coup. His sudden rise to power marked the beginning of an oppressive and corrupt regime. Known for his iron grip, Abacha silenced dissent, jailed activists, and looted billions from the treasury. Through his economic reforms, briefly stabilized Nigeria's economy, they were overshadowed by his brutal suppression of opposition and massive embezzlement of public funds, estimated to exceed $5 billion. In 1998, Abacha's reign came to its end under mysterious circumstances, leaving Nigeria to grapple with the scars of his rule. Next up, we have Jean-Bédel Bokassa, known as for his grandiose delusions. Bokassa's reign began in 1966, following a military coup that ousted President David Dacko. His 13-year rule is infamous for its extravagance and brutality. In 1979, Bokassa declared himself emperor in a coronation that cost over $20 million, a staggering amount for a country where citizens were starving. His delusions of grandeur were matched by his cruelty, which included the massacre of school children who protested his policies. France ultimately intervened to overthrow Bokassa in 1979, ending a reign that had brought immense suffering to the Central African Republic. Now, let's move on to Chad, a nation plagued by war and instability, a sad fate attributed to leaders like Hissène Habré, who came to power in 1982 through a Western-backed coup, promising stability for Chad. Instead, his rule became synonymous with terror. Habré's secret police tortured and killed thousands with ethnic cleansing campaigns targeting perceived enemies. Over his 80-year reign, an estimated 40,000 people lost their lives. Habré fled into exile in 1990, but justice caught up with him decades later when he was convicted of crimes against humanity in 2016. This landmark trial provided a glimmer of hope for survivors and set a precedent for holding dictators accountable. Francisco Nguema of Equatorial Guinea. On the west coast of Africa, we have Francisco Nguema, who became Equatorial Guinea's first president after independence in 1968. But his leadership quickly devolved into madness. Consumed by paranoia, Nguema ordered mass executions, banned intellectualism, and hoarded the nation's wealth for himself. His strange cruelty included executing prisoners while Christmas carols played in the background. By the end of his reign, Nguema had reduced his resource-rich country to poverty and chaos. in 1979, he was overthrown by his nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Basogo, and subsequently executed, closing one of Africa's darkest chapters. Up next, we have Hendrik Verwoerd, a white South African who typically goes unnoticed for their trenchers actions due to not being identified as a native African. Known as the architect of apartheid, Verwoerd served as South Africa's prime minister from 1958 until his assassination in 1966. He institutionalized racial segregation, creating a system that excluded the black majority from economic, social, and political life. His policies entrenched inequality, forcing millions into poverty and igniting decades of resistance. Verwoerd's assassination did not end apartheid, as his legacy continued to shape South Africa's oppressive system for decades until it is eventually dismantling in the 1990s. Halfway down our list, we have the controversial figure from East Africa, Omar al-Bashir of Sudan. In 1993, al-Bashir rose to power through a military coup that dismantled Sudan's democratic institutions. His 30-year rule was marked by violence, corruption, and division. Al-Bashir oversaw the genocide in Darfur, where over 300,000 people were killed and millions were displaced. His regime's brutality was further highlighted by widespread poverty and oppression. In 2019, a wave of mass protests forced his removal from power, despite being wanted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Al-Bashir's victims continue to wait for justice. Ironically, the country forged as a symbol of freedom marks this list with notorious Charles Taylor, whose journey to power began as a rebel leader during Liberia's civil war. Al-Bashir's victims continue to wait for justice. Next on is Charles Taylor, Liberia. Ironically, the country forged as a symbol of freedom marks this list with the notorious Charles Taylor, whose journey to power began as a rebel leader during Liberia's civil war. Taylor's presidency was a period of unrelenting greed and violence. He exploited Liberia's resources, using child soldiers and profiting from the blood diamond trade to fuel conflicts. Taylor's crimes extended beyond Liberia as he supported rebels in neighboring Sierra Leone, leading to a brutal civil war. However, his actions soon came to an end because in 2012, Taylor was convicted by an international court, marking a significant milestone in the fight for justice in Africa. Next up, we have one of the world's longest-serving heads of state, Paul Biya, who has ruled Cameroon since 1982. Biya rose to power following the resignation of Ahmadou Ahidjo, quickly consolidating his control through corruption and repression. His regime is infamous for rigged elections, suppressing of dissent, and economic stagnation. Despite widespread poverty and unrest, Biya has clung to power for over 4 decades, demonstrating the perils of unchecked authoritarianism. With the upcoming elections in Cameroon, will this finally be his way out? Let us know what you think in the comment section. Next is Mobutu Sese Seko, Zaire, DRC. And of course, we cannot compile this list without one of the most flashy and extravagant dictators, Mobutu Sese Seko, who reigned over Zaire. Mobutu Sese Seko, who reigned over Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Like many other dictators, he took over the country in 1965 after a coup that ousted Patrice Lumumba. Mobutu's kleptocratic rule drained billions from the country's wealth, leaving its citizens impoverished. It is said that in the peak of his powers, he used to sail up and down the River Congo in his super yacht, parading his wealth and status. His eccentric personality cult masked a regime built on corruption, brutality, and repression. In 1997, Mobutu was overthrown by rebel forces led by Laurent Desire Kabila. He fled into exile, leaving behind a shattered nation that continues to struggle within the consequences of his rule. Today, his family continues to enjoy the spoils that still remain well beyond his death. Last but not least, we have the infamous Idi Amin, a skilled general who seized power in Uganda in 1971 through a military coup that ousted Milton Obote. Known as the Butcher of Uganda, Amin's rule was defined by terror. His regime saw mass killings, ethnic cleansing, and the brutal repression of dissent. An estimated 300,000 to 500,000 people lost their lives under his rule. A rumor has it that many of the victims' bodies were dumped in the River Nile. Amin's bizarre acts, such as proclaiming himself the King of Scotland, added to his infamy, overthrown in 1979 by a Tanzanian-led invasion. Amin fled into exile and lived out his days in Saudi Arabia, ending his brutal terror over Uganda. He remains one of history's most notorious dictators. And that is our list of the top 10 worst dictators. Drop a name in the comment section who you think should make this list. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Pihoa Network, for more content on Africa.